welcome back to my channel. Today I have the honor of interviewing Lee Strobel. He is the author of Case for Christ. He's written many books that I love and have been very influential in my love for apologetics and giving a defense for Christianity. So Lee, welcome onto my channel.
Well, thanks, Ava. I appreciate you having me, and
Yeah.
congratulations on your ministry of apologetics.
Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to say a little fun fact real quick. My parents actually went to college with your son, Kyle. And
oh, come on.
Yes, your son was a substitute teacher for my mom in her philosophy class, I'm pretty sure. So that was so fun. When I told them I was interviewing you, they got really excited because
That's great. Well, he's now, he has his PhD in theology and is a professor at Biola University.
So first, just to kind of give a little preface for those of my viewers that aren't familiar with you, which I'm sure maybe none, but will you give just a quick introduction and a little bit about your testimony?
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago, met my wife when we were 14 years old, got married young. We just are celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary this month.
Oh, wow.
I always wanted to be a journalist, went to the University of Missouri, which is often considered the best journalism school. We like to think so anyway.
Yeah.
And got my bachelor's degree in journalism. Also went to Yale Law School. I got a Master of Studies in Law degree and became legal editor of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. And so I did a lot of articles about legal issues, the legal profession, Supreme Court cases, things like that, and then covered major trials, political corruption trials, and did a lot of investigative reporting as well. I broke a lot of stories involving, you're much too young to remember this, but it was a big controversy over the Ford Pinto automobile back in the 1980s. And I did a lot of exposés on that, and also on an individual who was actually framed by a police officer and sent to prison unjustly. And he ended up being released, and the police officer was convicted of official misconduct. So I did a lot of investigations as well. And I was an atheist. I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving, all-powerful creator of the universe was kind of crazy on the surface of it. It wasn't even worth my time to check out. And then my wife became a Christian through a friend who she met, a Christian nurse. And so I decided to take my journalism training and legal training and systematically investigate Christianity, which I did for about 1 year and 9 months, until I concluded that based on the historical evidence, especially for the resurrection of Jesus, that it would have taken more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. I came to faith on November the 8th of 1981.
Oh, I love that. And I didn't realize how, you must have done a lot of extensive research, because I didn't realize how long that process was. What was the monumental thing that made you go from being a hardcore atheist to following Jesus? What was kind of that? What was the pinnacle point there?
Well, good question. It was not one particular thing. It was a series of things. I think the case for Christ is really a multifaceted, a cumulative case. So that if you take one element out, it doesn't necessarily collapse the case. And there's not just one thing that really established everything convincingly, but it was truly the resurrection that I found compelling. I think Jesus clearly made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself, but anybody could do that.
Right.
The question is, did he prove it by returning from the dead? And so of all the evidence for the resurrection, I think probably the final bit of evidence that I found convincing was that disciples, we have 7 ancient sources that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that they encountered him. And their willingness to give their lives to that is pretty well established. And what makes that interesting is that they, of all people in history, were in a position to know for a fact whether this was true or not, because they were there. They touched them, they talked with them, they ate with them. Of all people who've ever lived, they knew the truth. And knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That's a persuasive bit of corroborative evidence.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have a lot of atheists on my channel that like to comment, which I'm all for. I love having dialogue.
Yeah.
But something that typically they bring up is, why is Christianity true compared to the other religions? And why can there only be one true religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you look at the potential worldviews, there's really only three basic worldviews, spiritually speaking. There's atheism, there's theism, or belief in God, and there's pantheism, belief that everything is God.
Yeah.
And in my book, The Case for Heaven, I kind of go through those different options and look at and compare why it is we can believe that Christianity stands head and shoulders above the other options. There's a lot of internal contradictions in other worldviews and so forth. I think what makes Christianity particularly interesting is it's the only world religion that is spelled D-O-N-E. In other words, every other faith is spelled D-O. You have to do something to earn your way to God. You've got to use a Tibetan prayer wheel. You got to go on a series of pilgrimages. You got to give alms to the poor. You've got to try to earn your way to God. Christianity is, so every other religion is spelled D-O. You got to do so. Christianity is spelled D-O-N-E. It's done. It's paid for. Jesus said on the cross, it's finished. And we just need to receive his free gift of grace. That's unique on world religions. But I think what's important in terms of the truth of the faith is when you look at Jesus claiming to be the Son of God and then backing it up by the resurrection, that contradicts every other faith system. In other words, let's choose Islam as an example. Islam teaches in Surah 4, verse 157, as I recall, that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and therefore there is no resurrection. It also says that God does not have a son. It also says that nobody can bear the sins of another. Well, those are fundamental truths that Christianity teaches as being true, and yet they're all specifically denied by the Quran in Islam. And the question becomes, where does the evidence point? And I think the evidence points powerfully and persuasively toward the truth of the resurrection. And so I'd say you follow the evidence. And when you follow the evidence, I think Christianity emerges as the most reasonable alternative among the limited choices we have.
Yes, I think it's interesting you make the point too. If something is true, the thing that contradicts it has to be false.
Right.
It doesn't, you can't have both. It can't be true and false, and then you get to heaven.
That's right. There's something cannot be true and false in the same way at the same time. I mean, so it makes sense that either Christianity is true or Islam is true, but they can't be true at the same time.
Another question that I get asked a lot is, where did God come from? Who made him, what made him, and why is that stronger? Why does the evidence point to creation versus evolution?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And it's kind of an example of mixed categories. One of the strongest arguments, I think, in favor of the existence of a divine creator is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it says whatever begins to exist has a cause. We know that the universe began to exist at some point in the past. Therefore, it must have a cause behind it. And what kind of a cause to bring a universe into existence? Must be powerful, must be smart, must be eternal or existing, because you can't have an infinite regress of causes. And must be immaterial or spirit, because it existed before the physical world. So you go through the list and you see that the attributes of this first cause match the description of the God of the Bible. Now, then who made God? Where did God come from? Well, by definition, God has always existed. You can't have an infinite regress of causes. At some point, you need to have a beginning point. And so who brought that beginning point, the beginning of the universe, into fruition? That must be a cause that existed prior to the beginning of the universe, which means it must be immaterial or spirit, must be eternal or existing outside of time until physical time was created. Must must be powerful and smart and so forth. So, you've got good evidence that there is a divine creator of the universe. By definition, God does not need himself to have been created. In fact, the argument is not whatever exists has a cause behind it. It's whatever begins to exist has a cause behind it. God didn't begin to exist. He has always existed.
Right. What are the big things that have changed looking back? And what was your evidence then for evolution? Were you kind of wondering about it? Because I know that it must have been kind of scary to change your worldview. Did you believe at the time that the evidence for evolution was strong? And why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, I studied science in high school and in college, and was convinced that the origin of life was spontaneous. It somehow happened in this rich pool of chemicals that Darwin imagined, and that the origin and the diversity of life can be explained away as random chance happening on genetic and variations in organisms and so forth. So the idea of Darwinism, of neo-Darwinism, seemed to make sense on the surface. But when you dig beneath it, it raises all kinds of questions. And so I wrote a book called The Case for a Creator, where I looked at the claims that, for instance, that life can begin spontaneously on its own with no outside assistance, and the difficulties with that, I think, are insurmountable. And so there's no good, to this day, no good Darwinian explanation that really explains the origin of life. And then you look at the diversity of life. You look at the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago, or whenever it was, where you have this sudden emergence of different body types and that have no precursors that would have been predicted by Darwinism. So you've got, I think, a lot of problems with trying to explain the origin and diversity of life just by looking at Darwinism. It's interesting that one atheist said recently, when somebody asked him, well, do you believe that human beings evolved from monkeys, from apes? And he said, well, as an atheist, I believe that human beings evolved from dirt. And he's exactly right. I mean, forget the idea of whether they evolved from it. You have to go back and say that somehow dead chemicals got organized into the first organism that then developed and improved and changed over the eons into sentient human beings. Well, the problem with Darwinism, it can't explain the origin of the universe. It can't explain the origin of life. It can't explain the origin of human consciousness. There's so much it cannot account for, that I think the explanation that there's a divine creator is more persuasive.
Was it hard / worth it to you at the time to change your worldview? Because my grandpa, he was an atheist for a while because his mom told him that if he became a Christian, he would get kicked out. And so I know that there's a lot of atheists that are in a way scared to change their worldview, because that could mean they lose their family, they could get kicked out of their home, and a lot of things they could lose. But do you have encouragement of what they gain?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I knew that it wasn't going to help my career as a journalist if I came out as an evangelical Christian. I looked around the Chicago Tribune newsroom at the time and saw very few people who would identify as being an evangelical Christian. It's just not a popular position to hold. And especially these days, increasingly, it's a difficult position to hold because it's not widely endorsed and embraced by the culture at large. And so, there is something you can lose. But to me, ultimately, we win when we pursue the truth. And I believe the evidence of cosmology, of physics, of biochemistry, of genetics, of human consciousness, of the resurrection of Jesus, I believe all this evidence points persuasively toward the truth of Christianity. And to align myself with that truth and embrace that truth, to me, makes sense. it wouldn't make sense for me to, in a sense, swim upstream against this torrent of evidence flowing the other direction. That didn't seem logical to me.
Right.
What seemed logical is that I would want to align my life with that which is true. And what is truth? Truth is that which corresponds to reality. And so I believe that the evidence for Christianity points toward the reality of Jesus being the unique Son of God. So I think you follow it because it's true, and you let the chips fall where they may.
I interviewed J. Warner Wallace a couple months back, and he said that he's not a Christian because it works for him, but he's a Christian because it's true. And I think that at the root of it, you shouldn't become a Christian if it's just going to work for you, or if you're going to be accepted into a new culture or whatever. Because I think, I mean, culture progresses, it changes, and that's not a strong foundation. So I think you bring up a really good point.
Yeah, and he's absolutely right. I think, Christianity is not true because it works. Christianity works because it's true.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction.
Oh, for sure. I absolutely agree. What would you say to the people that have the refute or the belief that Christianity is a fairy tale, or that believing in Jesus is just a distraction from the real world? Do you have kind of a explanation for why it's not a fairy tale?
Yeah, I think we have good historical evidence that Jesus not only existed, not only claimed to be the Son of God, but he backed up that claim by returning from the dead. So I think the historical data is powerful and persuasive that he is who he claimed to be. At one point, Jesus got up before a group and he said, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And the audience understood what he was saying because they picked up stones to kill him. They said, you're just a man and you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. You could claim, anybody could claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later returned from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. And so I would say, pursue the evidence. Look at the historical data. So much of what we know from ancient history is based on one or two good sources of information. And yet for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrection of Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical.
A lot of atheists will say, well, so what? I could die and come back to life. There's a lot of people that have claimed to die and come back to life. I had a comment the other day that said, Jesus isn't special. I died and came back to life. And what I asked was, because he said that there was an ER and all of this, he explained kind of how it happened. And he didn't claim to rise again. I think that's kind of the thing that sets Jesus apart, is he said he would do something and he did it. And so to kind of add on to that, I was wondering if you could kind of explain the proof for his resurrection. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, he didn't die. There's the swoon theory, or there's the replacement theory. So what is the evidence for why he actually did die, and why is it significant to his resurrection?
The evidence he did die, for instance, we have lots of persuasive evidence that he died. First of all, we not only have multiple first century sources in the documents of the New Testament, we have 5 ancient sources outside the Bible that talk about his death. We have Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, worked for the Romans; Tacitus, another early historian; Meir Bar Serapion, Lucian. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that he was killed by execution. So we have, as I mentioned, most of what we know and believe about ancient history is based on 1 or 2 sources. But not only that, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, peer-reviewed, scientific medical journal, carried an analysis of the death of Jesus Christ. And their conclusion was, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. So
Yeah.
here you have an independent scientific medical journal coming to that conclusion, on top of which we have no evidence anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion.
Yeah.
So we can be confident that Jesus was truly dead. In fact,
Yeah.
you can go to an atheist New Testament historian like Gerd Ludemann, formerly of Vanderbilt University, and he'll tell you that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable.
Right.
That's the atheist historian speaking.
Wow.
So I think this question of whether Jesus was dead is clearly resolved just by the historical data.
And I think what's significant about Jesus is, again, he claimed to do it. And also, he was in a tomb for 3 days. And then, and people witnessed his death. And I think a lot of people don't consider what the Romans do for the crucifixion. There was flogging. He had to carry his own. I mean, there was insane things that happened to him. It's just, like you said, it's indisputable.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ava. In my book, The Case for Heaven, I do talk about cases of near-death experiences where people have been dead, declared dead, and yet return to life and report seeing things and hearing things that would have been impossible for them to see or hear if they had not actually had an out-of-body experience. So I believe there is good evidence that that happens in some cases. But the Jesus instance is far different because, as you mentioned, he predicted that this was going to, in advance, that this was going to happen. That's important. Secondly, as you say, his nature of death was so brutal. You mentioned the Roman flogging. Now, let me quote to you a description of an eyewitness to a Roman flogging. He said the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles and tendons and bowels of the victim were laid open to exposure. Wow. I mean, Jesus was in hypovolemic shock, that is, shock from great loss of blood after his beating. And then he was crucified.
It's impossible to not die from, that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of atheists bring up is, well, what about the people who haven't heard about it? Is God going to condemn people to hell because they haven't heard? They'll bring up, and I think a tactic atheists use, and I wonder if you could maybe speak to this from when you were former atheist, they attach personal experiences. They attach, my brother died and he was an atheist, so is God going to send him to hell? What would you say to that? I know it's a sensitive topic because, we're kind of dealing with people that died that, atheists love. So what would you kind of say to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Bible isn't explicit in terms of what happens to people who never hear the message. It's never really explicit about that, but we can draw some conclusions. First of all, we know from Romans 1 verse 20 that we all have knowledge from the creation that we see that God exists, but we tend to suppress that knowledge. On top of that, we all have a moral standard written on our hearts that we've all violated. That's why we feel guilty when we do something wrong. Right. So in that sense, we've all deserve, we've all, if we know from creation that God exists, if we know we have a moral standard that we violated, then we're accountable for that, whether or not we ever encounter Jesus or not. I mean, we're accountable for a life in which we have sinned. We've fallen short of God's teachings. We've fallen short of how we should live our lives. And so that's a reality that we face. We also have to keep in mind, the Bible says that in Deuteronomy, that will not the judge of all the earth do right? And the point of that, I think, is that no one will be able to walk away having been judged by God and shake their fist and legitimately say that was unfair. We will all see the ultimate fairness of God.
Right.
And so I think we can trust that God is going to do what is right in the end.
I think, and we have to, like you said, the Bible doesn't explicitly say, but we can, like you stated, we can draw conclusions based on God's character. He is full of grace and he's righteous and he's, the righteous judge. And so evil, in the end, evil and good cannot be coexisting. They have to be separated. And so I think you made a really good point. And I want to be respectful of your time. I know that, you're busy of other things to do, but do you have any encouragement for maybe atheists or people in my generation?
Yeah, let me go back for just a second because I want to mention one other thing. This question of whether those who haven't heard. There's a new book out published by InterVarsity Academic, which explores the question of whether or not people who did not get an opportunity to hear the gospel presented in this world, would they have a chance to hear it after death, post-mortem opportunity, it's called. Martin Luther apparently had some belief in this, interestingly enough. I explore this in my book, The Case for Heaven, and there is some evidence that points in that direction. But the Bible does say we are appointed once to die and then the judgment, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily immediate after death. So there is, ultimately the issue of will God be fair? And however God does handle those who haven't in this world had a chance to hear the gospel, I think we'll walk away saying that was ultimately fair. In terms of your other question about what I would say to people who are skeptics of your generation, I would say pursue the evidence. Look at the evidence. Look at the evidence of cosmology, the origin of the universe. Where did that come from? What's the most logical explanation? Look at the evidence for the fine tuning of the universe, which is so precise and so incredible that you can't write it off as just being mere chance. Look at the information in DNA. Nature can produce patterns, but it can't produce information. There's more information, more words chemically spelled out in one cell in your body than the number of words in 200 years of the Sunday New York Times. This is not a pattern. This is information. And whenever you see information, there's always an intelligence behind it. So I say, look at the science, but also look at the history. Look at the question of the origin of life. What's the history of that? Look at the history of Jesus, of the historical evidence for him having lived and claimed to be divine, dying and resurrecting from the dead. Look at that with an open heart and open mind. Be like an umpire in a baseball game that calls a ball, a strike a strike. Look at the moral argument, the ontological argument. There's all kinds of arguments and evidence that I believe point powerfully and persuasively toward the truth of the Christian faith. And I would just encourage anyone to say you have nothing to lose and everything to gain if you, with a sincere heart, investigate where the evidence points. That's what I did as an atheist. And the Bible says in the Old Testament in Jeremiah, in the New Testament in Hebrew, that if you sincerely seek God, if you wholeheartedly seek God, you're going to find him. And then the question is, what do you do with it? What do you do with him? I think the most logical step to take after concluding that he is real is to receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for us on the cross when he died as our substitute to pay for all of our sins. Yeah,
that's so good. I encourage you guys to go read The Case for Heaven, The Case for Christ. I know you have many books that talk a little bit more in depth about the questions that I brought up, but I really appreciate you again for spending the time or just taking the time out of your day to talk to me and, to share why there's good evidence for what we believe. I think a lot of people think that we believe a fairy tale or it's a distraction. But
I think what you're doing, Ava, is so important, especially with the next generation. You mentioned J. Warner Wallace, and one of the things he said is that evangelism in the 21st century is spelled apologetics. It's important for Christians in this skeptical generation to be able to explain why they believe what they believe. I'll let you know, too, that we have started a new center at Colorado Christian University called the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. And we have undergraduate degrees, bachelor's degrees available in apologetics. We have master's degrees. We have certificate courses, which are for people that don't want to get a degree but want to learn. And it's 100% online.
I love that.
Yeah.
So check that out. That would be totally up my alley. In April, we went to SES, which is Southern Evangelical Seminary, and it was very interesting. And so I'm assuming it's kind of the same, kind of like an apologetics course, one-on-one. I would love to look at that. That's awesome that you have that kind of place to be a facility for people to learn more about apologetics.
Well, if you go to strobelcenter.com, STROBEL Center, all one word, strobelcenter.com. It has all the information about our courses. They're all accredited. They're all 100% online. So this is stuff that you can do from your own home. And I'd encourage people, take a course on the resurrection. We had 40 PhDs that we gathered together to create 91 courses.
Wow.
And so we have courses on the resurrection, we have courses on Islam, world religions, evangelism, science and faith.
Yeah.
More about that. So I encourage any viewer to consider, taking some courses from us. We'd love to have you.
Definitely. I think, yeah, and something that I've kind of taken from your ministry is there's evidence. I think we just need to be willing to find it and willing to, we need to be humble to the information that we're given. Because if you pursue the truth, I believe that it does lead back to Christianity. And so that's the reason I'm passionate about apologetics and why I appreciate what you're doing so much. So thank you again. I appreciate you for talking with me. And I think that I've been so inspired by your books and everything. So yeah.
Well, I'm inspired by you, Ava, and what you're doing. I'm proud of you. I'm inspired by you. I pray and hope you'll continue and to learn, to grow, to be an influencer for God, and to let this next generation know that Christianity is not based on fairy tales, wishful thinking, legend, or make believe or mythology. It's really built on a solid foundation of historical truth.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching this interview. Go check out all the resources I have in the description of his books. And do you have a YouTube channel? Where's the best place that they can find you?
LeeStrobel.com is my website.
Awesome. Yep. I will leave that in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next interview or video. Bye.